Hello, everybody. It is that time of year again, time to get serious about garden planning. Now, for those of you who saw my original garden planning video back several years ago, I am going to reiterate some of the same points that I made in that video, and that's because my garden planning methods are essentially the same now as they were back then. But today, I'm going to walk you through the exact steps that I am using to plan my garden this year. Now, for anyone new to my channel, welcome. I am growing in Ohio, and I'm a seed trial manager by trade. So every year I grow hundreds of varieties of vegetables, herbs, and annual flowers from seed, evaluating them for performance and taste and disease resistance, and give feedback to breeders and seed companies on how they did for me. Now, because of this, my garden process may be a bit more detailed than, say, your average home gardener, but I still think there are parts of my process that any gardener could use. So let's jump right in. Step one is making a wish list. Now, this to me is one of the most enjoyable parts of the whole process, and it really helps me to get through those dismal gray midwinter days here in Ohio. Even though a lot of the varieties that I grow every year are not of my own choosing, they're things that are sent to me, I still leave room in my garden for my old favorites and for new varieties that I personally want to try. So when that big pile of seed catalogs start arriving in the mailbox, I like to sit down with a notebook and paper and a big old cup of coffee and start on my wish list. Much like making my Christmas wish list when I was a kid, this is my list of dreams. What would I plant if I had unlimited resources, time, and energy in any given season? And every year I end up with a list a page long from every single gardening catalog. So after I get my wish lists compiled, I slowly work on whittling them down to a realistic amount. Or honestly, not so realistic. I still end up with more seed than one person could ever manage in a season, but I try. So when working on whittling down that wish list, one of the most important considerations for me is obviously, what will I actually use? What does my family actually like to eat? I am absolutely 1000% guilty of growing like 35 different varieties of hot peppers when my family will realistically only use a couple pounds in a given year. Now, there are all kinds of charts and blogs out there on the internet advising you on how much of any particular vegetable to grow to feed, say, a family of 4. But these are really only jumping off points. They're great if you're starting from scratch and have no idea, but you'll find that you really end up tweaking those values a lot based on your own family's needs. But to really hone in on what my family actually uses in a year, I've gone to an inventory system. So anything that gets frozen or canned or put in the pantry, I jot down on an inventory log, and every time we use anything, I cross it off. At the end of the season, I can get a realistic view of what we've actually used and know going forward for the next season what I need to preserve more of or less of, and say, do I need more strawberry jam or grape jam? The answer is strawberry. And then, of course, the next big consideration for whittling down that list is the actual amount of space I have available, which I will get to in just a minute. Step number 2 in garden planning is to do a seed inventory. In preparation for all of the new seed that I'm getting in, I will go through all of my old leftover seed first. I will warn you, my seed organization system is not pretty. I've heard from a lot of folks who are using a much more, shall we say, aesthetically pleasing methods of arranging their seeds. And if I were starting all over, I might look into something like that. But I just use gallon-sized Ziploc bags, write the crop name on the outside. So whether that's carrots, lettuce, broccoli, tomato, they either get their own bag or they get grouped with a similar vegetable. And the Ziploc bags get placed in a Rubbermaid tote. Now, I try to keep one tote specifically for cool season crops, one for warm season crops, and then the large seeded items like beans and corn get their own individual totes. Before this current season's seeds come, I will go through all the old ones and get rid of the losers. So the ones that didn't perform so well or I didn't like the flavor of, and I will identify the ones that I liked so much that I want to grow again this year. Then when I start getting my new seed in, I'll just file it into the appropriate baggie. The number 3 step in planning, as I mentioned, a lot comes down to space. What do I realistically have room for? Now, I've not gone out and done full measurements of my garden in several years, so I am way overdue. This year, I'm actually mapping out my entire garden. So I am getting measurements of everything: the beds, the walkways, any structures like trellises I have in here, all of the areas where I've extended outside of the original garden fence, everything. Now, I just mentioned this in the last video I did, but if you are starting from scratch and going through this exercise, make sure that you give yourself enough room in your walkways. And take into account what the space will be like when it's chock full of plants. My garden seems like I've got enough room this time of year when it's pretty much empty, but come the middle of the season when I've got plants everywhere, it feels very, very crowded and tight. So now that I've got all of my measurements, I am going to map this entire garden out. Now, back when I did my first video on garden planning, I was not a big fan of any of the garden planning apps on the market. I liked them in theory, but not in practice. When I would actually sit down to try to lay out my garden, it just became way too tedious. So for years, I've done all of my planning in an Excel spreadsheet. I still use that spreadsheet for my preliminary planning, but I have finally found an app I really like. So let me show you the Excel spreadsheet that I use first. My master spreadsheet here has a lot of info, but what I find most useful are the columns for my common name, variety name, the source, or basically the catalog that I got it from, the reason for growing. Now, this is helpful for me because I often have a very specific trait that I'm looking for, such as specific disease resistances, flavor profiles, or colors. For example, you can see here that my main reason for growing tasty green cucumber is to check the anthracnose resistance. I also try to mark down when, or at least put an X for if I ordered and received the seed, when I start the seed indoors or either transplant it outdoors or sow directly outdoors, and the date it matures. I also have all of these specific measures such as rankings for plant habit, vigor, and yield, but the most helpful of all is just this space for my overall notes, comments, and observations of the plant. More on note-taking in just a bit. So you can see where that Excel sheet does help me organize a lot of data, but what it is lacking is there's not a great way to actually have a visual map of the garden. And I also don't have a quick and easy way to add my photographs to my notes, which was always a source of irritation for me because I have file folders full of images of these plants, but my notes and my photos have to be housed in two separate places. So at the end of last year, I discovered Garden Savvy's HortiSketch app. I really like this one as compared to other similar garden mapping apps that I've used through the years. So to kind of give you a preview here of what I'm doing, I'm actually breaking up my garden into segments because I find it easier to deal with individual sections of the garden versus trying to put them all onto one map, just because the space is so large. So I've got a layout set up for each section of my garden. Eventually I'll go through and map out the gardens at my parents' as well, but this is a project that's gonna take a little bit of time. So you can see here, you've got options for beds and paths and structures. Basically, I'm taking the measurements that I took from earlier and just applying them all in here and laying out my beds so that I have a really nice visual of things. Once I've got my gardens all laid out, I'll go back to that list of plants that I want to grow for the 2023 season and see what I can actually fit in here. So I actually go in and just start laying out all of my crops into these garden beds to make sure that everything I want to grow fits. I also wanted to mention, for those of you who are looking for just a garden calendar and place to keep your notes, Seed Time also offers a nice app. I've heard from a lot of folks that they really like that option, but that one does not give you this garden mapping feature. Now, full disclosure, I find that apps like these across the board are a great jumping off point. But in my experience, I really have to kind of tweak those planting dates to fit my own needs. They don't always match up exactly with what the apps are telling me. So for instance, I have found the best date for starting all of my brassicas is mid-February. That doesn't quite align with the mid-March recommendation of the Seed Time app. I found that the Hortisketch recommended sowing dates are a little closer to being in line with what I use. But a lot of that comes down to your individual microclimate. So here, because it gets quite hot typically by say mid to end of June, I find that I have to give my brassicas an earlier start and have them maturing right before that heat of summer really starts to set in. Otherwise, I do not get a good crop. And if I were to use that mid-March starting date, I would not be hitting that deadline. So again, a lot of those planting dates are going to give you a good rough idea of the time of year that you're going to want to start, but you may find over time that you tweak those a little bit. Now, as I'm planning, I'm also trying to think about more vertical gardening opportunities. So being able to grow more plants with less of a footprint. Now, if you're interested, I've linked my video all about the ways that I'm currently vertically gardening in the description below. But I'm always looking to add to that. So as I'm plotting out my garden map, I'm looking for all the opportunities where I might be able to add arches or trellises or any kind of structure that will allow me to grow up. Cattle panel arches have been one of the most functional vertical gardening implements that I've added to my garden. So I'm definitely looking for spaces where I can add those this year. And the fourth big step in my garden planning process is making sure that I have some kind of a note-taking system in place. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of having an area where I can jot down notes for all of my garden crops. Now, as you can imagine, this is very important for me because I'm keeping notes of all of these crops basically for a living, but I highly recommend to typical home gardeners that you do this as well. This can really help you keep track of the things that you like, the things that did terribly, the things that you definitely want to grow again, the things that you don't. It's also a great way to keep track of pests and diseases and to really hone in on those planting times. Like I mentioned in my Excel spreadsheet, this was just a column with a space to write whatever notes came to mind. Quickly getting down what I want to remember, and when I have time, I just come in on the computer and transcribe all of that into my files. Now, if you're into a more low-tech version, just keeping a written notebook is a great method as well. I just have a bad tendency of misplacing notebooks and then not being able to find my notes when I need them. But I will tell you, this is the real reason that I like the Garden Savvy app so much. In addition to that Hortisketch garden mapping and planning feature, they have a feature called Garden Manager. It's a place to track inventory, make notes, add photos, pin helpful articles, and more. For instance, here are some of my varieties from the 2022 garden. I've got a folder for each crop, and then within that folder, I've got the varieties I grew, plus the supplier, my notes, and my favorite part, I can add my own image here. I can also set myself a reorder reminder if I want to grow it again next year and need more seed. There's also space here to add information about the suppliers I use and like or don't like, notes on pest and disease management, a place to save growing guide information from reliable sources, and more. Now, if you, like me, prefer to have all of your garden information in one handy location and keep everything super well organized, you might want to try Garden Savvy's Hortisketch app too. If you do, be sure to use my coupon code, which is Jenna5 at checkout for $5 off. And you get the Garden Manager for free. And number 5, the final step of my garden planning process, is to do an inventory of all of my seed starting supplies and garden tools before I get into the crazy busyness of the gardening season. There is not much more aggravating than getting ready to start your seeds for the season and realizing that you don't have any of the supplies that you need. I have done this more often than I prefer to admit. I'm ready to jump in, and then all of a sudden realize that I don't have any of my ingredients for my seed starting mix. I don't have any seed starter on hand. All of my trays are busted up and broken, or my heat mats don't work. So this time of year, typically in January, I like to make sure that I've got all of those ingredients for seed starter on order, or whatever I'm using to start seeds that year. I make sure my trays are in good shape. I make sure my lights and my heat mats are working. And I make sure that I have any plant food that I might need. I also like to do a once over of all of my big outdoor gardening tools to make sure that things are clean and sharpened, anything that I might have missed when I put it away in the fall. And I'm going to make sure that I have all of the supplies I need to deal with pests and diseases. I have a few major pests and diseases that are issues pretty much every year. So I'm going to make sure that all of my garden hoops and netting are in good shape, because I use those to protect my brassicas from cabbage worms, my cucurbits from things like squash bugs and vine borers. I'm going to make sure I have plenty of surround kale and clay, because I use that to protect my cucumbers from cucumber beetles, amongst other things. Some years I also end up using a copper fungicide to protect from things like blights and mildews and black spot. And with solutions like this, they're best used as a preventative. So it's important for me to have those on hand before the disease becomes apparent. Basically, if I know that we're in a year when the conditions are right for those types of fungal and bacterial pathogens, I might start a preventative maintenance program. So I want to have those supplies on hand. So let me hear from you all. What is your garden planning process this time of year? Are you a plan everything out to the very last detail kind of person, or a just let's wing it and see what happens kind of person? And is there anything that you're doing differently in your garden planning process going into this 2023 gardening season? Drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.